Hi everyone, I'm Oyster Bay Town Clerk Rich LaMarca. Traveling through the town of Oyster Bay, chances are you've passed by one of the town's few remaining Friends meeting houses, cemeteries, or other historical landmarks. These stand as a reminder of the significant role the early religious society of Friends, also known as Quakers, played in the history of our town and America as a whole. The original English settlers of Oyster Bay were slow to establish any formal house of worship for the first half-century of the settlement's existence. However, a number of early colonists subscribed to a faith known as the Religious Society of Friends, a Protestant religious movement that began in England during the mid-1600s and gradually made its way to Oyster Bay.
People on Long Island were very persecuted. They couldn't practice their own religion. Quakers were practicing in people's homes.
People were rebelling against the Puritan aspect of the English church.
The Society of Friends devotees, at first mockingly referred to as Quakers because of the way they were said to tremble when their inner light spoke to them, were often harassed and sometimes arrested for their unconventional beliefs. Nevertheless, Quakerism continued to spread throughout the Oyster Bay hamlet, and in 1672, members of some of Oyster Bay's most prominent families invited George Fox, founder of the Religious Society of Friends in England, to speak here at Council Rock on Lake Avenue in Oyster Bay.
He was preaching here in Oyster Bay because Oyster Bay was kind of the center of those things in those days. And matter of fact, Reverend Prime wrote an ecclesiastical history of Long Island. In that, he referred to people at Oyster Bay as that ungodly lot.
George Fox's sermon at Council Rock likely outlined the fundamentals of early Quakerism, which centered around simple living, nonviolence, honesty in business, empathy for the poor, and direct access to God for both men and women. In addition, the subject of slavery almost certainly entered the presentation.
They were one of the first groups who denounced slavery and made it illegal within their body to hold slaves.
And the abolition of slavery wasn't the only controversial component of the Quaker belief system. Quakers were pacifists, and many refused to join the local militias, even as war with Great Britain grew closer. They also believed that men and women had equal significance under God. These unconventional principles further cast Quakers out of the mainstream of Oyster Bay society. Still, they persisted, and the Friends movement continued to expand throughout the region.
In 1725, Thomas Pearsall and Samuel Underhill agreed to fund the construction of the Matinacock Meeting House. They purchased a plot of land on the corner of Piping Rock and Duck Pond Road and a small plot of land across the street for the adjacent burial ground. And a carpenter by the name of Mott agreed to construct the meeting house for a sum of £20, 9 shillings, to be paid in peas, Indian corn, and pork. As you look around the meeting house, you'll see that the meeting is divided in two. That's because in olden days, Quakers would meet for worship, and they'd also meet for business. Meetings for business were to conduct the affairs of the monthly meeting. And the women would meet separately from the men. Women on one side, men on the other side of the partition, and the partitions would be lowered. We can tell the difference between the two sides because there's a stairway on each side. The stairway on the far side has a wall, whereas the one on the near side does not have that wall. And that's because on the far side, it was the women's side of the meeting house, and when they walked up the stairs, we didn't want anyone to see the women's legs.
Although fire destroyed the original 250-year-old Matinacock Meeting House in 1985, dedicated Friends oversaw a painstaking reconstruction using the original design and materials salvaged from the 1725 structure.
And all the fire department was able to save was the front porch and some of the floorboards, which we were able to reclaim, flip upside down, and reuse in the current structure.
Another Quaker landmark you may have driven by is here on Quaker Meeting House Road in Farmingdale.
So in 1698, Thomas Powell was one of the founders of the area's first faith community, the Bethpage Friends Meeting, when the first Quakers in the area began gathering in each other's homes. The original Bethpage Friends Meeting House was built 20 years after Powell's death in 1741. It was the first house of worship constructed in the Bethpage Purchase area.
Rebuilt several times over the centuries, the Bethpage Quaker Meeting House, constructed in 1890, still stands just across the road from its original location. The structure overlooks the headstones of the Bethpage Friends Cemetery, where Bethpage founder and devout Quaker Thomas Powell is believed to be buried. Powell's home, where Friends meetings likely took place as early as 1698, still stands nearby on Merritt's Road in Farmingdale. One of the most significant Quaker sites still remaining in the town of Oyster Bay is on Old Jericho Turnpike in Jericho, in a quiet, remote area that is rich with Quaker history.
We started worshiping at Jericho in the 1600s. We didn't worship on this property or in this house. We worshiped in the homes of sympathetic Quakers. The Widow Seaman is always mentioned, and the Willets home as having been a place where Quakers were free to worship. So they held meetings for worship in these homes for many, many, many years until they built this meeting house.
Completed circa 1788 just off today's Jericho Turnpike, the Jericho Meeting House held to the Quaker concept of simple construction without any of the embellishments that were common to traditional houses of worship at the time.
It doesn't look like a church. There's no steeple, there's no bell, there's no stained glass. All of those things were considered distractions. And that idea is carried inside. You can see there are no adornments in here except for the two posts that hold the gallery, have sort of a chamfered edge, and as well the top of the post on the facing bench, it's considered an adornment.
One of the meeting house's most noticeable interior features is its separate worship areas for men and women.
But eventually, because Quakers believe in this equality, they believed women were just as equal as men, that they eventually started to worship together.
As noted earlier, another strong value that had caught up with local Quakers by the time they formed the Jericho meeting was the belief that slavery was immoral and should be abolished, not only in the town of Oyster Bay, but throughout the American colonies. At the core of this movement was noted Quaker minister Elias Hicks, founder of the Jericho Meeting House.
It was about 1775, at the time of the American Revolution, that the Quakers decided they should do something about the slave holding in the area. And they recruited Elias to go to the local families and convince them that they should free their slaves. He did it so well that 81 slaves were freed within the first year, and by 1776, there were over almost 200 slaves freed.
Hicks lived in this home where he employed freed and possibly runaway slaves as farm workers.
Elias took a horse and buggy, often with a cousin or a friend. Otherwise, he was on horseback alone in all kinds of weather, traveling hundreds of miles at a time. He was that driven to convince people to join the Quakers and to join the abolitionists.
Just across Old Jericho Turnpike lived Elias and Jemima's son-in-law, Valentine Hicks, and his wife, Abigail, who were also devout Quakers and abolitionists. Their former home, which hosted various upscale restaurants over the years and has since been completely rebuilt, is also believed by some to have been a safe haven for runaway slaves. To many of today's residents, the remaining Friends landmarks are little more than life-size curiosities from a religious movement that's often marginalized in history books. These sites, however, represent an important chapter of America's past and one of our stories well worth preserving in the town of Oyster Bay. I'm Town Clerk LaMarca, and this is Oyster Bay Today.